Froze.
I didn't freeze. You guys froze.
It was you.
Yeah, we're being warned. Our internet.
Colin, if you put it on the TV like we do, then you have the whole living room.
I don't want to see the whole room. You guys, I think it's terrifying, the idea of putting me on the TV screen. It's a terrible call, Mila. You want less of me, not more of me. So we'll start this week on our kind of on our Lenten series proper. Again, we're going to be looking at the parables. So I thought we'd start with kind of the first introductory parable out of Mark 4, 1 through 20. I suspect most of you have read the parables before, so feel free to jump in with your own thoughts. I did intend these to be a little more discussion-y, even though I'm aware that Zoom doesn't participate, and I'll probably freeze, and most of my most brilliant wisdom will probably look like this. So we'll just assume and push through anyway. So just parables. I think probably most of you know this, what a parable is, but the way we're going to be looking at them specifically during Lent is these are pictures, these are images meant to help us know in kind of our hearts what the kingdom life looks like. It's kind of like this. It's kind of like this. Jesus sharing his own insight. The parables, I think we can misunderstand if we bring kind of our high school English brains to it and treat them as these elaborate allegories. There are sometimes allegorical elements, including the one we're going to look at today. But if we're thinking like the Pilgrim's Progress, or we're thinking like, you know, Dante's Inferno, and these elaborate different kinds of allegories, and that we have to read everything into, we are missing the point of parables. These are oral stories. They probably work a lot more like a joke, in that it's aiming more at a punchline or kind of a single thing at the end than it is the way you tell it. Just like you can still laugh at a joke with different people telling. So we're not going to get real stuck on the text here. We're going to recognize that most of the people Jesus is working with and trying to teach what the kingdom is like are illiterate. The word for word doesn't matter, and he probably told a lot of these parables multiple times. The pictures generally are simple enough. You can, on the first hearing, you should have a strong image of what he's describing. But they work because Jesus is often kind of pushing us to think about God or the way of living in the kingdom very differently than we are tending to think about it. So it's like many things. The picture is simple, but living it, understanding it, letting it into our heart of hearts is why we're looking at it again this year. Lent is a time for retraining, focusing, and I think the parables are just a great way of reminding ourselves what the kingdom is actually like. So we'll dive in. I'm looking at kind of the first of the big parables, most likely out of Mark chapter 4. This is the parable of the soils. And some just kind of simple reminder, kind of context stuff. You may have heard this before I actually read it, is Jesus, where he was teaching in this area, was in farm country. He most likely was pointing to things as this crowd is sitting around him. He says, well, you know, the kingdom of God is kind of like that and that and that, which I think gives us some kind of astuteness to just his awareness of God, and the fact that he just seemed to see God's presence everywhere and everything. There were little daily things everywhere that could teach us about who God is. So let me just read kind of this first section first, and then we'll dive in. So Jesus began to teach beside the lake again, and such a large crowd gathered that he climbed into a boat there in the lake. He sat in the boat while the whole crowd was nearby on the shore, and he said many things to them in parables. While teaching them, he said, listen to this. A farmer went out to scatter seed, and as he was scattering seed, some fell on the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on rocky ground where the soil was shallow, and they sprouted immediately, but because the soil wasn't deep. But when the sun came up, it scorched the plants, and they dried up because they had no roots. And other seed fell among thorny plants. The thorny plants grew and choked the seeds, and they produced nothing. Other seed fell into good soil and bore fruit, growing and increasing. The seed produced in one case a yield of 30 to 1, in another case a yield of 60 to 1, and in another case a yield of 100 to 1. He said, whoever has ears to listen should pay attention. So we're lucky. This is one of the few parables that Jesus actually translates for us, and kind of where he's going for it. But I want to point out kind of a few things that I just learned this week that I think changed my own picture of how this parable is working. One, I've always remembered after a mission trip where we were down in rural Arkansas, and I can't remember if I was teaching on this or if the Bible study was on it or something, and this good old boy local who was a farmer came up and he just goes, just so we're on the same page, I absolutely hate this parable. I'm like, okay, what's the problem with it? He's like, this is the worst farmer in the world you're talking about. Farm seeds are so valuable, no one in their right mind would just be scattering them around. And if they saw them fall on the rocky path or something like this, they would go and save them. This is a terrible farmer, and I've always hated this story. It showed Jesus knows nothing about farming, which probably is not true. He grew up around this stuff. He probably knew this stuff well. And the peasant farmers that he's talking to are probably a lot more poor, and probably those seeds are even more valuable they are to this good old boy in Arkansas, which tells you a little something about God, I think, that God is willing to throw this seed out, knowing full well the types of soil that it's landing on. To God, it does not seem to be a waste because there might be an opportunity, right? He's perfectly willing to waste something that is valuable, knowing it won't come to fruit and to fruition. How often are we a little more mercenary about things? We'll only put our energy and our effort into something we know will come into it, right? So again, just even those first couple lines, this farmer is out scattering seed. So just kind of the different types of soil real quick. The path was, with the way they did farming is they actually would have walked and scattered kind of from, so there's one kind of set path that would have been a little bit risen, and it basically would have been walked on so much, and it would have been used, it would have been baked by the clay. So it's basically concrete, like it's just sitting out there. And birds knew this. They knew if you were a rotten farmer and you were throwing it on the path, dropping it below your feet, they knew to come get it. So this was a very common picture of these people swooping in. These first two soils, this kind of rocky ground and these weeds, I think I had the image for both of those. Like, so rocky ground, I'm thinking like a bunch of almost like river rock or something. Seeds go in and they're trying to work their way up through the rocks. But the rocky ground that he's talking about is probably more like what we have in a lot of parts of town here. And that's, the soil was good, but it was only about 2 inches deep. And then they had this layer of real rocky clay. And so unless you know what you're doing, you just glance at it, you've got about 2 inches that looks like perfectly good soil, but the roots are just going to hit it and die, right? They can go out, it's just not enough to grow. And so the surface of it looks good. It's a little hard to tell. That's very similar to what's going on as well with the weeds. What they would do a lot of the time is they would just go through with like a scythe and chop the very top off. So again, it looks like perfectly good soil, but down below there's this choked mess of weed roots that if you don't pull them all the way up, they're going to come up, which again is a very common thing, very common problem in their farming at the day. So again, the image isn't one of these, like I feel like there's all these weeds that are growing up, these thorn bushes, and the poor, grain or whatever is trying to grow up through them. It's, again, they go down below the surface, and instead of finding good room to grow, they get choked out because there's already a bunch of dead roots. There's just gunk in the way. So again, take it for what it's worth, but these were kind of the assumptions I think Jesus people would have had. And to me, it's interesting in each of those cases, just by looking at it, the rocky path, pretty much everybody would have known. This isn't going anywhere. All the devil has to do is swoop in and snag it, right? One little distraction and it's not producing any fruit. But the other two, it can be a little hard to tell immediately. These roots aren't going to go anywhere. In some places, they go down, they're shallow, and then the sun shows them for what they are. Suffering shows them for what they are. In the second grouping, you can't see it, but they can't grow anywhere. They can't go anywhere because their roots are bound up with all this other junk, these weeds that are worthless that are down below. And then I think the very last thing, this point that Jesus starts with here in the parables overall, is he says, anyone who has ears to listen should pay attention, ears to hear. And I think the implication there is, and I think the use of the parables is, I'm not just going to spoon feed you this thing. I'm not going to tell you the answers. This is something that you need to work at. This is something that you need to kind of gnaw on and tease out in your own way. This is something you need to make your own. I think like a good teacher, right? Bad teachers will tell you the answers. Good teachers will make you work it out on your own, so you own the knowledge, you own the way. And I think that's what he's going for with a lot of these pictures and parables. He's saying, look, if you've got the ears to hear, if you're willing to chew on it, if you're willing to think about it, the kingdom of God is so available. The kingdom of God, there's little images of it everywhere around you. You can just, the most daily thing, where any of us sit. I think in Jesus' argument, we're all sitting in living rooms and kitchens right now. If we look around the room with ears to hear, with eyes to see, there are things here that can be images for the kingdom of God, ways of helping people think about how God moves in the world. Do we have ears to hear? Do we have eyes to see God in the everyday? Because Jesus is using the most common things he can come up with. And yet he's connecting it to these eternal things. They're not esoteric. They're not hidden. They're right in front of you if we have eyes to see and ears to hear. Continuing in verse 10. When they were alone, the people around Jesus, along with the 12, asked him about the parables, and he said to them, the secret of God's kingdom has been given to you, but to those who are outside, everything comes in parables. This is so that they can look and see but have no insight, and they can hear but not understand. Otherwise, they might turn their lives around and be forgiven. So this is a little bit disturbing, right? It's like, is Jesus not wanting people in on the kingdom? Is he trying to hide the truth from him? Is he not sure? And I actually think he's kind of saying the opposite there. He's saying, I'm going to explain it to you guys because it should be so obvious to everyone. And I actually think that last line is a little bit sarcasm. And he's quoting Isaiah there. And I think it comes across a little more fuller in Isaiah. But again, they would have got the reference because they memorized big chunks of the Bible the way we don't. And so I think we should actually be reading this isn't, they look, they have no insight, and they can hear, but they don't understand. Otherwise, they might turn their lives around and be forgiven, right? I think Jesus is kind of frustrated here because he's put these really simple everyday images in front of both the disciples and everyone else. And if they had ears to hear, they should really be able to understand the sort of thing that God is up to. It should be really obvious. But also Jesus in his grace is teaching them because he knows it's not obvious. It's not easy to us. But I think the key here in these parables is, again, are we willing to work at it? Are we willing to chew on it and figure out the truths ourselves? And I think the real key is, are we willing to trust? I think there is a different place when we trust Jesus and recognize that he does know the kingdom and is wanting to teach it to us, rather than just being, oh, that's a very interesting religious teaching, right? When you're in, it comes out differently, and we're going to be able to understand the parables differently than someone who's just looking at this with, kind of a hands-off abstract. I know lots of people who don't follow God and Jesus, who've read the Gospels, and they have very good insights a lot of the time from we don't, but they ultimately can't understand what Jesus is talking about, because the parables and all these other insights to the kingdom implies a certain level of trust in who Jesus is and what he's up to. Again, that's not to say they can't get insights out of it, but the ultimate insights, the way it sinks down into our hearts, does require a level of trust, which they're showing. They go directly to him, they trust him, say, look, I don't get it, help out here. And that's what causes him to explain. In verse 13. So the question I wanted us to think about as we are going through this, again, the kingdom represents a lot more than just salvation, right? The kingdom is a different way of thinking. The kingdom is a different way of relating to God, relating to the world. And so, yes, does it involve our eternal salvation? Absolutely. But it also involves being kind of a foretaste of that kingdom, of that salvation here in the world. And so rather than reading this in a way of saying, okay, if I'm saved, I get to be one of the fruitful ones. If God was wanting to shake us up a little bit, which I think is behind a lot of these teachings, God is trying to shake up the way they think about God. If God felt like he needed to drop a bomb on your understanding of him and the way you're living, because he wants to invite you into something bigger and scarier and deeper. Which of these barriers might God's message run into in your life right now? Okay, so that's the question I want to have kind of hiding in the back of your mind as he explains this parable. He's going to tell us what these different types of soils represent, which kind might be the biggest distraction if God was wanting to shake you up and teach you something new about himself or the kingdom right now. Okay, give me a thumbs up if we all kind of understand the question we're listening for. So again, listen in the spirit, recognizing God knows you, God knows what's going on in your life right now, and listen to see if one of these types of soils jumps out at you. Don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables? The farmer scatters the word. This is the meaning of the seed that fell on the path. When the word is scattered and people hear it, right away Satan comes and steals the word that is planted in them. Here's the meaning of the seed that fell on the rocky ground. Again, this is the one I think with the strong base layer. When people hear the word, they immediately receive it joyfully. Because they have no roots, they last for only a little while. When they experience distress or abuse because of the word, they immediately fall away. Others are like the seed scattered among the thorny plants. These are the ones that have heard the word, but the worries of this life, the false appeal of wealth, and the desire for more things breaks in and chokes the word, and it bears no fruit. And the seeds scattered on good soil are those who hear the word and embrace it. They bear fruit. In one case, a yield of 30 to 1. In another case, 60 to 1. And in another case, 100 to 1. So ask yourself real quick, how might the devil or indifference, how might abuse or suffering, how might comforts, cares, coveting keep us from leading the fruitful kingdom lives that God desires for us and wants to invite us into? What might be distracting us or stunting our possibilities of growth? Because those fruit that he talks about are really abundant. There's not a farmer out there in the world who wouldn't be thrilled with 30% yield. And yet some of us are having 60 and 100 according to God. It's pretty amazing. What's the condition of our hearts? What are the distractions that we have to watch out for? And what are we going to do about it? Any thoughts or questions on this parable of the soils and God's expectation of kind of fullness and fruit in our lives?
Well, I think the busyness of our lives, at least before COVID, but it seems like we have stayed so busy anyway, tends to fill things up so much that verse 19, the worries of this life, it's just almost impossible not to have your mind occupied with that day in and day out when you've got so much going on and so many people to take care of and so many things to do, and a lot of them are totally legitimate, like raising small children, but it can really reorient your thinking to just this plane on which we exist, I think.
Anyone else? Any other thoughts? Yeah, I think as my guess would be culturally as Americans, unless we are suffering something pretty distinct, that's the one that my brain went to as well, that thickness of the roots, we can't get our roots down in because there's just already so much gunk down there getting in the way. Anyone else? Any other thoughts on this parable? What sorts of things might be interfering? And the fullness, the fruitfulness
Everyone else
God
is
desires. Everyone's muted. Well, unmute yourself. Okay, here's the other question though. What do we do about it? Whether it's that busyness, whether it's something really tragic and hard going on in our lives. How do we not let that define our existence? How do we show trust? How do we show that fruitfulness? If these are the conditions of our lives, what do we do about it?
I was going to go back to your first question just for a minute. And initially, when we were going through the different groups, and I said, well, I saw it as a progression, and so I was ready to say that, I was certainly in the last group. I mean, that it's on good soil. I mean, it's all, I am where I'm supposed to be. But then as I started thinking it and also listening to Deb, there are, lots of distractions. And for me, the distractions have been, and I think you used the culture. The things that are going on in the culture, that have, that are different than what I thought that they were. And so, it's caused me to question. And then God always has to keep reminding me, that he has not changed. But that at the end of the day, and I love when we can tie what we're seeing in the New Testament back to the Old Testament, to know, that so they were probably thinking some of the same things that we are thinking now, and then we get to, sorry about that, then we get to see the fruition, that's how I probably didn't say it right, but we get to see what happens. They didn't, that God was true, to what he said, and that he was going to, to work it out. I hope that, that makes sense, that these distractions that's just what they are, they're distractions. And so it's going to be a day when those distractions are no longer going to be there. And we're going to be so rooted in him that nothing is going to be able to shake us. I guess that's the bottom line for me.
Anyone else? Any other thoughts on some of the stuff we have to watch out for, or what we actually do about it?
I guess if we're going to be creating busyness for ourselves, because that's in our nature, just that it's purposeful, that it's meaningful, that there's some good reason for what we are doing. Raising children is a good thing.
Can't help some of that busyness.
Yeah.
It's not like you can.
But, choosing to
stuff.
do things that are furthering the kingdom, I guess.
Yeah.
So
keeping us open.
It's
to
worth
it.
looking at all the things that we do and making sure that they're in line.
Yeah. I'd encourage you to keep chewing on this one. I think the fullness of the kingdom and God's availability, Jesus is picking these daily images. I think if we can train our hearts and our minds to look well, to listen well, have those ears to hear, I suspect we're going to find images of God in the way of his kingdom all around us. Again, are we willing to see God right in front of our eyes or not? Or are we looking at other things? Are we allowing other things to get in the way? Because I think God is just always inviting us into something bigger and fuller than we want a lot of the time. And I think that's a lot of what Lent should be about, and the kingdom. Thinking about the kingdom should be about in these parables. So keep thinking about that. Those, are they distractions right now? Is there suffering going on right now? Are our roots going down where they could be? And asking, just like Jesus' disciples did, like, I don't get it. I don't know what you want from me. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing right now. So please help me out here. And I think those are the types of prayers that Jesus is all about.